Hey everyone, welcome back. Dave in History for the Ages here. So this is a really interesting topic, Operation Paperclip. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't, but I'd really like to know in the comments after you watch all this, do you think it was a justified operation? And you can see here America's secret hunt for Nazi scientists. And what was going on, as I'm going to explain here, is this was a whole plan to recruit Nazi scientists to come to the US. This began basically towards the end of World War II, 1945, primarily to 1950. Those were the kind of main years when the United States went to recruit about 1,600 Nazi scientists, engineers, anybody in those fields to help the US. And not many people knew about this. When this was happening, maybe just a few hundred people knew about it. And the idea was they bring in these Nazi scientists, but they also give them immunity. A lot of them, as you're going to see when I talk about a couple of them, were involved in horrific crimes. And the US said, well, we'll erase all your crimes, we'll give you a visa, get a high paying job, but you then have to come in and help us with our various scientific needs. Um, and this goes to a whole other question. I have a video on this already, and I didn't include this because I'm making this after. But do the ends justify the means, right? I have a whole video on that you can watch and think about as well. When is it okay to do these things and not? Now, why, right? Why was the U.S. interested in doing this? What's the motivation behind it? I think that's really important. Well, obviously, the Nazi Germans had incredibly advanced, cutting edge rocket technology, aviation, they were working with chemical weapons and chemical research, and they had a lot of advancements. And this is the end of World War II, but as I explain in my World War II lectures and my Cold War lectures, it is also the beginning of the Cold War, right? So if you know anything about the end of World War II, you have D-Day, and of course we have the invasion, and we're coming in from the West. But the Soviet Union under Stalin, they're pushing in from the East. It's like a race to Berlin. Who's going to get there first? And the US and others understood full well that the Soviet Union, if they end up moving into Nazi controlled land and take over more of that land, all of that territory will become under the Soviet sphere of influence. And so the US wanted to get this technology because they saw this whole Cold War coming. And to be very blunt, if the US didn't do this, when you go, was this right or wrong? The Soviets were going to. In fact, the Soviets already were trying to do some of this as well. And so a matter of, well, okay, so if the US doesn't do it, the Soviet do it. Do you still do it knowing what some of these folks were all about? And so let's talk about a few of them. I mean, there were quite a few. Like I said, there were 1,600 of these folks. And this is kind of just a basic overview of Operation Paperclip. But I want to go through at least a few of them that you understand what they were and what their ideas were, that what they brought in. So probably the most famous is von Braun. He was the one who's very famously involved with the V2 rocket and later helped design the Saturn V rocket. And anybody who's, space folks know the Saturn V is, of course, the rocket that helped us get to the moon. And you can see him there on the bottom in this image here. So he was one person we brought in, probably one of the more famous one. You see this guy Strughold. Actually, I don't have a picture of him here, but he was very much involved in medicine. But the problem, yes, he comes in Operation Paperclip, but we also know he was tied with the Nazi human experimentations, which were probably one of the most evil things the Nazis did. And yet we brought him in to help various U.S. interests. Another person you see on the top image here is Arthur Rudolph. He also helped along with von Braun and the Saturn V. But again, what we know about him is he was part of using forced labor in the Nazi weapon factories. If you ever saw the movie Schindler's List, right? The whole thing with Schindler's List is Oskar Schindler comes in and he creates this kind of weapons factory, but the weapons factory never really produced any weapons. And so the whole idea was he was using as an affront to actually protect the people who would have been, part of the Holocaust and would have been murdered by the Nazis. So a very amazing movie if you haven't seen it. But this guy, Arthur Rudolph, he wasn't no Schindler, right? This guy was literally using forced labor in the weapons factories to end up fighting against the U.S. and Americans and so forth. So you have that. So then, what's the impact of all this, right? What was the impact of Operation Paperclip? And probably the most significant was the space race. When I cover the Cold War, I do talk about how the Cold War was, how the space race was very much motivated by the Cold War. We wanted to get there before the Soviet Union. It wasn't some grand scientific desire. And without this Operation Paperclip, it's very arguable that we may have not beaten the Soviets to the moon. It also helped a lot of other technology, ICBMs, jet technology, a lot of, as I said, medical innovations. And so this was something that did have practical, important impacts, which again goes to the question is, well, then was it justified? So that's a very important topic to think about. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the secrecy of it. And when did people even know about this thing? Because it isn't something people knew about when it was happening. So as I said, basically Operation Paperclip, when it took place, only a few hundred people knew about it. And it was kind of partially declassified in 1973, but most of the details basically was some pressure. People were like, hey, we need to know what's going on. And it wasn't until 1998 there was something called the Nazi War Crime Disclosure Act, and that led to kind of the full background and all the information and all the people who were involved in it to come out. So that's essentially what Operation Paperclip was all about. It's really interesting. If you like this video, I have another one here on the fake army that that fooled Hitler. Unlike Operation Paperclip, I don't think there's any nuance there. That was probably definitely a good thing to do. This one is a bit more complicated. So, I kind of be curious to know what you think about it. Please like, share your comments, leave your thoughts. I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts on this. And thank you for watching. All right, everyone. Have a great day.